Hello, Superhero Ethics fans. As many of you know, Jacob is no longer serving as co-host. He's still going to be a supporter and friend and hopefully an occasional guest of the podcast, but he's had to step back in part because of an exciting opportunity he's had the chance to take up. He wasn't able to tell us about that during his last episode because it hadn't yet been publicly announced, but now that it has, he's recorded a special message to let you all know what he's up to. Please make sure to stick around to the end of the episode and check that out. And now, on with the show. Today on the Superhero Ethics Podcast, special guest Steve Peterman is joining me for a discussion of the ethics of Q from Star Trek. We're diving into questions like, what is his motivation? Is he trying to test humanity or just help them? Does he actually have any real motivation or just whatever the heck comes to his mind? And why is he so fascinated with Janeway? All of this right after an ad that we have no control over. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Matthew. I'm your host. And as I mentioned, joining me today is our guest, Steve Peterman. Steve was a guest earlier on, I think, Steve, you've been on 2 episodes, right? One about Sanderson.
Just the one.
Okay, that's right.
Yep.
Steve was a guest on our on our episode about the Brandon Sanderson books. Steve, how are we doing today?
I'm doing all right. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm really glad we decided to do this topic because it meant I got to go back and watch some episodes of Star Trek that I have not seen in a long time.
Yeah, they're good ones too.
Yeah. It was interesting too because it having seen Picard a lot recently, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit today. I knew that Picard was a big change from the original Star Trek shows and that the newer generation from 20 years ago or 30 years ago now in terms of how the tone of it, but going back and actually watching those TNG episodes was a pretty good reminder of like, wow, just how different these were.
And he looks so young, especially in the pilot.
Yeah, no, that's super true.
And Riker without a beard, of course.
Yeah, that was a little painful to watch. I watched with my partner who was a big TNG fan as a kid, but like had never actually watched them all in order. She just watched a lot that were on syndication, I think, or actually on whatever her family had on DVD. And for some reason, they didn't have the first season. So she kind of like jumped when she first saw Riker without a beard. We're like, who's that? So that was funny. Well, so talk to me a little bit about yourself and just this topic in general. So you've been a big Star Trek fan for a while?
Not so much Star Trek. I was a Star Wars kid growing up, actually.
Nice, okay.
And I got bored one, I guess, month or so when I was sitting at home, and decided I was going to actually sit down and watch Star Trek. So I watched it through from the beginning of TOS through the end of Voyager.
Nice.
And Enterprise. I watched like 4 episodes of Deep Space Nine and just couldn't handle it.
Interesting.
Don't at me.
Okay. No, that's cool. That's cool. It is so many people's favorite. I'm curious for you, what about it didn't work?
I don't know.
Okay.
I just watched like 4 or 5 episodes, couldn't handle it.
That's legit.
It didn't really click with me.
I admit it was not my favorite until like a couple of seasons in. And honestly, most of the reason why I watched it is I was so sick of my friends making constant references to it that I didn't understand. That I just like... and
fair enough.
If that had been in the day where we really had like Memory Alpha and stuff like that were a lot more accessible, I probably would have just read it all that way. But yeah, so what makes you interested in Q, the character? Like what are kind of your overall thoughts there? And why do you think he's one worth exploring?
So when I was in college, I actually took a class about Trickster Gods.
Oh, nice.
Whether they're from, comic books like Loki or actual Norse mythology Loki or from the Epic of Gilgamesh or what have you.
Uh-huh.
And it's actually one of the only classes in college I got an A in. It was a writing class.
Nice.
I was not a writing person. I was a math and science person.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, I got an A in it, and it really just clicked with me. So the idea of a trickster god in a science fiction setting is really fascinating to me. I love science fiction.
Yeah.
Whether it's books or movies. Actually, I like fantasy and science fiction both.
Uh-huh.
I kind of lump them together because they're kind of the same thing, but not really.
It's funny. I'd never thought of the Trickster God concept until you mentioned it, but now it seems pretty fitting. But just for those of us who maybe haven't really studied it, can you say a bit more about what exactly the Trickster God concept is, and then how kind of Q fits into that?
What really epitomizes the Trickster God concept is in one of the Thor movies, Thor is telling a story about how he picked up a snake, and then the snake turned into his brother and stabbed him, and was like, "Haha, gotcha." Um, that really shows that the Trickster God is just trying to do pranks for the sake of pranks because they're
Right.
new experiences.
Right. Now, my understanding, again, I probably not studied as much as you, but and I think this is kind of a relevant question when we get to Q. Am I right that sometimes, not always, but that sometimes the prank is intended to teach something, whether it's to kind of like, that often it's to kind of poke a hole in hubris or arrogance, or to
Oh,
help someone
absolutely.
realize, yeah.
It's absolutely has a purpose that isn't not necessarily just haha gotcha. It's haha look how ridiculous you're being. A
Right.
lot of times it is reductio ad absurdum.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to kind of take that idea and say, okay, what if we stretch this to the absolute extreme, just how silly are you going to be? Um,
Right.
like to me, the Emperor has new clothes. The Emperor's new clothes is kind of a Trickster God story. Not that there's a Trickster God involved there, but just that idea of like pointing out the truths that no one else wants to see, but doing it in story form, or by playing with people and things like that.
Hmm.
Well, and that's actually kind of a good way to introduce our one of the biggest questions that I'm really interested in is, where does Q fall on that in terms of his interactions with with our casts? And I'll say on this episode we chose a specific number of episodes to watch just because we don't have all the time in the world we'd want. So we're focusing on mostly things from TNG with one episode from Voyager. But we'll probably be bringing up stuff from Q, as well as actually a Q-like figure from the original series. And I will say, if you have not watched Star Trek before, we're probably going to spoil all of that. So just, if you don't want to watch Star Trek, that's fine. But if you're halfway through a rewatch of it or something like that, and you don't want to be spoiled, maybe hit pause now. But back to Q, for me, one of the most interesting questions is, where does he fall on that kind of Trickster God idea of, does he have lessons he's trying to show the crew, or is he just kind of screwing around because he's an immortal being who's bored, and as Quinn gets into in that Voyager episode, maybe kind of lost touch with the idea of not of morality necessarily, but the idea that he's so bored that he doesn't care if he hurts people while playing because he just wants to find some entertainment.
Yeah, I think there is some of the I'm just bored, so I'm looking for something to do.
Uh huh.
But I don't think it's necessarily I'm looking for anything to do. I think
Right.
it's I'm looking for some people that might need a lesson or might need some guidance, and I'm not just going to tell them how to solve the problem. I'm going to lead them to how to solve the problem.
Yeah. I
Um,
Go ahead.
the TNG pilot is where we're really introduced to Q as a character, and he just shows up, stops the ship out of nowhere. They're on their way to Farpoint Station to pick up their first officer. So Riker's not even on the ship yet, and he just stops them, sort of kidnaps a bunch of the crew off the bridge, and is like, "Hey, humanity's a kind of a screwed up race." He actually calls them a savage, barbaric child race,
Yeah.
and shows up in a bunch of varying costumes from, let's see, what's the first one?
The first one is kind of it's a Sir Francis Drake, like a medieval, because he
Oh,
says he
right,
wants to be
yes.
a fellow ship captain. I think the idea is that he's the difference between the 1500s and the 2300s is so meaningless to him that he doesn't quite know which one to pick at first.
Right. So he shows up as a ship captain, and then is like, "Oh, is this not the right uniform?" And then he changes into like a World War II captain,
Mm-hmm.
and then he changes into I think it's a 22nd century captain.
Oh yeah, 21st century, the time when they're using guards, military was being drugged in the
Oh yeah.
evil trial times.
And then eventually he just kidnaps them to a courtroom with a bunch of heckling peasants.
Uh huh. Well, and I think that's where one of the first questions begins, is because at the beginning of those Farpoint episodes, it's presented as humanity is going to be on trial primarily for their morality. As you said, are they still a savage, barbaric race? And are they so much of a danger because of their terribleness that they should go back and not be allowed to become even more powerful in space? over the course of the episode, that shifts somewhat, and it becomes more a test of their intelligence and their ability to problem solve and figure things out.
Right.
And here's always the problem that I have with things like this, is because on the one hand, I think I can look at these episodes, especially what we know later, and kind of say that on some level this was never a test. This was never a trial. That I don't think Q was ever really thinking that he was going to tell humanity to stop. It was more that he was using that means to push humanity, to try and, to see, can you really do as well as you can, and can you, especially because so many times later he talks about the incredible potential of humanity and that he wants them to reach that. And so I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, am I seeing that the writers did something really subtle here? Or is this just not is this a case maybe of not the most consistent writing, and that they kind of started with him with one motivation and shifted toward the other, both by the end of these episodes and even more so as the show goes on?
Oh, I think it's definitely the second thing, where they started with one thing and then they were like, wait, this is exactly the same character we had in that one episode from TOS, and then had to change it a little bit.
Yeah. Tell us. Oh, go ahead.
So in the TOS episode, there's a character named Trelane. Basically, the Enterprise shows up at this planet. Their officers are all kidnapped off the bridge, very transporter-y style. And then they all wake up on this planet, and there's this guy dressed up in very 16th century garb. And he's like, hi, I'm General Trelane, retired. And then he does a whole lot of Trickster God-y things, like there's sourceless light, there's a fire that's not giving off heat, and all these things kind of clue the crew into noticing that maybe things aren't 100% what they seem to be. And then some officers die, and some officers, like, there's a red shirt that dies. Spoilers.
That happens.
Yeah. And then at the very, very end of the episode, Trelane's parents show up, and they're like, hey, time for dinner. Put your toys away. Yeah. And then they actually apologize to Kirk and bring his crew back to life and transport him back to his ship. And they go on their way. So it's a very Q-like child person who's just playing with his toys with no thought to the consequences. And that's very much the character that Gene Roddenberry imagined Q to be, and then presented this episode, and then his producers were like, no, maybe tweak it a little bit.
Is that your guess, or do you actually have you read stuff about the behind the scenes process?
I've read a little bit, not enough to actually cite, but so it's mostly a guess.
Okay. I mean, that's all we have for most of this, but I think that's a pretty reasonable theory. It also brings up what I think is one of the most interesting parts about Q, is that he does seem, in a lot of ways, he reminds me of a Fae, in terms of like that often they're presented as both incredibly powerful but very childlike, and having kind of a lot of whims and pleasures while also having some overall plan. The other thing that makes me think of Q as childlike is that he does often, like, people will say something just in passing, and he will take it as, aha, you just made a contract, The example that most stood out to me is the whole idea of the trial starts because, Picard, in anger and just kind of saying how ridiculous this is, says, like, are you trying to put us on trial? And Picard clearly says this as an accusation, but Q takes that as, oh, okay, you just offered to go on trial. Fine, I accept your offer. I think literally he says those words, accept your offer. And I really love that because it gets to me. I think that I think that's part of the Trickster God motif also, is kind of taking people at their word, even though it's not quite what they meant.
Right.
But certainly it seems very much in that Fae idea of, you have to speak very carefully because they will take your words very literally, even when that's not what you meant.
Mm-hmm. And then we actually bookend TNG with Q episodes, which is great. Right. The series finale of Next Generation is also a 2-part Q episode. And we actually go back to that courtroom, and it bookends TNG very nicely. But in that one, Q says, "I will answer 10 questions that can be answered with a yes or a no." And then Picard goes down this series of questions, and one of them is why. And Q's like, "Aha, not a yes or no question. You forfeit the rest of your questions."
Yeah. Yeah, it's very much like I'm going to hold you to the rules, but also get to change the rules as we go.
Oh, absolutely. He changes the rules all the time. He even says it'll be a fair trial. LOL.
Yeah. Well, let's use that trial motif for a minute, because you're right. It is very much the framing device of the entire show, because it's and I think actually the more I look at that, and I don't think they intended this in the first episode necessarily, but I think it makes the last episodes kind of brilliant, is it basically winds up being, the first episode, Picard is saying, like, let me on our journeys prove to you that we are not the things that you think we are. And then at the last, he's kind of saying, okay, well, let's look back over the 7 years. What have you learned? What have you accomplished? What has changed?
Except that it does it the correct way and not the way that, like, Stargate does it with a clip show.
Yeah, no, exactly. Though listeners of this podcast know I generally have problems with time travel, and I do with this once again. But just going on that trial idea, I mean, my first question is, do you think this idea of, like, of seeing humanity the way Q claims to, and judging us for it, for being a childlike, barbaric, savage race, is there some validity there? Is this just him having fun? Does he have a point there?
I mean, human history is full of savage, barbaric, childish things that people have done, individual people, groups of people, and Star Trek lore even more so, because they have the eugenics war.
Right.
So, yeah, there is some truth to humanity being a savage, barbaric child race. But there's also truth to what Picard says about, hey, that's not all we are.
Yeah. He at one point makes a comment about, or I'm not actually, now thinking about it, I think this is just something that I was thinking as I was watching it, is my question for all of these always is, by what standard? Like, he says grievously savage. So what do we know of other races that they are more or less savage? And I like this concept, because I like the idea of sort of seeing humanity against these other things. But for us, of course, it's impossible, because we don't have any other standards to look at. We have no idea what another race of sentient beings, how grievously savage they would or would not be.
Well, the other examples we have are the Klingons, pretty grievously savage. The Romulans, not quite as bad as the Klingons, but still pretty bad. The Ferengi, which they have their own moral
Capitalism
code.
is a different kind of grievously savage, but still pretty awful, yeah.
And then the Vulcans, which I guess are on the other side. So of the 5 races that we have a good picture of, humans are in the top 2.
Yeah. Well, and that's why I do think to some extent that, and again, I'm sort of saying, like, what can we understand about the character, even if this wasn't necessarily what the writers intended? Because I think when you look at Q overall, that, and especially in that last episode, at the last trial episode at the end of the 7 seasons, he shifts it and he makes it much more about, and I think he actually says a couple things about, we the Q know that humanity has this incredible potential, and we actually know that, you might even surpass us one day. And so this is about, kind of both making sure you're worthy of it, as well as making sure that you are, that you can reach that. And so if you think about it, if you understand that that's where Q winds up, it makes me wonder if in this first trial, it's not as much the, I think that you really are the most terrible thing, as much as it's I think you actually have amazing potential, and I think the motivational habits of a Marine drill sergeant will work, so I'm going to tell you what a pathetic, stupid person you are to try and make you do better. Which I think is generally proven to be a pretty awful motivational tactic, but for a childlike, all-powerful being, could maybe make some sense. Am I headcanoning too hard there?
I won't tell your drill sergeant you said that about him.
Well, okay, thank you. You actually know him, and in the judging program, you know both of my drill sergeants, so I appreciate that. But yeah, what do you? Am I kind of? Does that fit, or do you think that's kind of stretching too much?
No, I think that makes sense. I think that a lot happens to Q in those 7 seasons of TNG, and he gets reprimanded by the Continuum. He makes up with the Continuum. So I think the motivations of the Q Continuum might have changed as well. Um,
Yeah.
but it definitely wasn't their intention going into 7 seasons of the Next Generation to have Q be this growth character. I think they had him
Oh
come
yeah.
into to the beginning as kind of he's going to be the baddie of the week,
Mm-hmm.
and then John Delancey was like, "No, this guy's great. I want to do it again."
Yeah. I think it's funny. There's two things to say there. One is that, as I mentioned, my partner had not seen much of these early season Q. She mostly had seen in the later seasons, and especially on other shows, where he becomes much more a figure of whimsy and ridiculousness, and like in this first season, he's very sinister in a way. He's ridiculous and funny, but he's also terrifying in a way that I think gets lost by later seasons. And she was saying like that she loved Q because she thinks he's kind of like fun and ridiculous, and that the Q of the first season was so different. The other thing that brings up for me is, I think it's important to remember, I at least have now gotten so used to the idea that, you know, when a show goes on, especially a science fiction show, generally when they're writing the first episode, they already have a pretty good sense of the plot arc of, if not the first season, of at least the first season, if not the whole story arc. And so I think it's tempting to go back and apply that same kind of idea to these older shows. But I think you're right. It's a good reminder that when this was much more episodic television, the writers had no idea what they were doing. They were saying, let's write an episode now, and then maybe later we'll do something with the characters. But yeah, I think that the idea that they were planning what they were going to do with Q in season 7 and season 1, like that wasn't part of a television back then.
Right. If you go back to old television, like Doctor Who or early Battlestar Galactica, you might get 4-episode arcs, 3-episode arcs, but you wouldn't get continuity between that and the next 3-episode arc.
Right.
And they made them all to stand alone, because if you missed an episode on TV, you missed it. It was gone.
Yeah. And I think that's true about continuity as well, because, you know, for most fans, when you didn't have the internet you didn't have Memory Alpha, and you didn't have the ability to go back and watch any old episode, you know, if a character appeared and he'd appeared 2 years ago, well, now you're trying to remember from 2 years ago, is this character consistent to that? And Star Trek comes about, I think, kind of just at that. Actually, this is something I haven't thought about much, but I'm wondering if this has been written about. TNG is written right at the time where that's changing. It starts in, I believe, 1989, and at least I remember the web first really becoming a thing when I was in high school, which was 91 to 95. So over the course of this show being written, the ability to track those things really changes. And so it's kind of a different question, but I wonder if that's something that kind of changed the writing a little bit when that became much more possible.
I don't think it was so much the internet as, you know, VHS was a thing.
Oh, yeah, that's also true.
You could go out to Walmart or whatever 1989 shopping stores look like, probably Target, etc., Kmart. You could go out and buy VHSs of Star Trek.
Yeah, that's true. And also Star Trek. I mean, I think even the original series, there were probably fans who were writing stuff down and were just dedicated fans, that there was probably a lot more memory of, you know, there were a lot more fans who would remember what had happened, you know, last season for the original series of Star Trek than most other TV shows. But still, yeah, it's still such a technological difference. One of the things that we talked a bit about earlier, the humanity being the grievously savage child race. And then by the end, he's saying that humanity has all of this incredible potential and that he loves humanity because they're so unique. And you read a lot more science fiction than I do, but just going on the little I've read and the science fiction television and movies I've seen, it seems that there's a real trend of, it's hard for people to imagine that humanity would just be one more race that's interesting but kind of, you know, middle of the pack. Am I right in thinking that this is a trend in a lot of science fiction of humanity has to either be like, you know, one of the worst or one of the best?
Well, I think that's just hubris.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, why write about yourself as just mediocre and not totally noticeable?
Right. It should be we're the best. We're the best at everything because of course we're the best. Why wouldn't we be the
Right.
best? Um, Star Trek actually is on that spectrum, but it's not. Humans weren't the first into space.
Right.
When they did the first hyperspace tests, they drew the attention of the Vulcans, and the Vulcans kind
Right.
of shepherded humanity into the space age. Um, and when they got there, they ran into the Klingons who were already there, and the Romulans who were already there, and the Ferengi who were already there, and basically everyone else we've already talked about who was already in space. And their whole
Yeah.
thing is we're going to explore the galaxy and see who else is here.
Which is always an interesting conceit to me because there's often this idea of we're exploring all of these, like, unknown, not foreseen things. When you're sort of wondering, like, couldn't the Vulcans just sell them a map and, like, tell them, like, and I think this gets better over the shows go. But certainly I think it's that hubris idea sometimes of, like, if we haven't been there, then it's unexplored. Which is an interesting thing of where Star Trek goes. Let's shift to I'm sure we're going to keep talking about Q himself, but I want to shift more to the powers of Q and what that does to someone, because we watched a number of first season episodes, which I will say are great for Q, also a little painful because the first season had some real problems. Wow, Denise Crosby cannot act.
She really cannot.
In that first, the encounter to far point. Wow. But great person, I'm sure. No, not meaning to disparage the person, but please no tweeting terrible things at her. That's being a shitty fan. But yeah. But there's one episode early in, I had it written down. It's called Hide and Q, where Q actually gives William Riker the power to become a Q. And here again is one where I am really confused by Q's motivations, and I think it's just a little bit of bad writing, because on the one hand, he seems to be trying to say, like, it would be a failure of humanity for Riker to want to accept these powers, but he also very clearly wants Riker to accept the powers to be part of the Q continuum. Is that just bad writing, or do you think there is something there or is that kind of part of being the trickster god of trying to fight someone against getting to the point that you want them to get to?
So Q as a character is all about testing specifically the bridge crew of the Enterprise. And I feel like...
And then later Voyager.
And later Voyager, and I guess there's a Deep Space Nine episode that I obviously haven't seen.
Yeah.
But it would not surprise me if this was just a test of Riker. That he didn't actually give Riker the power to be a Q. He just jumped into Riker's mind and was like, oh, you're trying to make this happen? Haha, I made it happen. Now you think it was you.
Oh, I like that. Yeah.
Now, that's nowhere written down. Memory Alpha's probably not got it. It's a fan theory that I may have seen somewhere or come up with. I don't know. It's been a long time.
You're
I'm a fan.
It's a
there,
theory.
fan theory. Got it. But it would not have surprised me if that was Q testing Riker as a subset of humanity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could. So, do you think what is the result he wants then? Like, do you think is in his mind there ever a chance that Riker is going to become part of the Q, or is that all just the facade because he wants to see if Riker will survive temptation?
I don't think that Riker was ever in danger of becoming a Q. I think this was all about temptation.
Interesting. So that at the end, like, because Q at least appears to be disappointed that Riker didn't do the right thing, and that that he's kind of lost his bet with Picard. It seems though that would be very Trickster God to sort of be like, oh nope, you got me again, and then kind of walk off going, good, they learned the lesson I wanted them to, and they don't understand my role in it.
How many times has Loki died to prove a point?
Oh yeah, that's a good one. That's a really good one. And that's an interesting one, because actually, and here's a question, is in the Trickster God mythology, and maybe this changes between different Trickster gods, are the people supposed to walk away going, wow, that Trickster is such an idiot, I can't believe he did that, having learned a lesson and no idea the Trickster taught it? Or are they supposed to walk away going, nope, you know what? Loki helped us realize something we didn't realize. that damn Trickster, but he's better in some ways.
It's very much, I learned a lesson, but that Trickster guy's an idiot.
Yeah. Interesting, because you never see the truth behind it. Okay.
The Trickster mythologies are always written with a moral to the story, as most mythology is. So it's always written with the moral of the story, and it's almost always the moral comes from the Trickster God, but the Trickster's often the butt of the joke or something like that, and they're never actually the hero of the story unless you really, really think about it.
Okay, well, by that definition then, I think, and again, I don't know if this is headcanon or much better writing than it might appear, but then that makes Q, especially in this episode, Hide and Q, makes so much more sense. Because, like I said, there felt to be a really weird tension between him both wanting Riker to join the Q, but also wanting Riker to resist the temptation. So I really like that perspective of, that the whole time he's actually trying to say, like, no, I want to see if Riker can avoid this temptation. So here's the other question is, does Riker avoid the test? How does Riker do on the test, do you think?
I think Riker gets a C- on the test.
Yeah.
He passes, but barely.
Right. Well, yeah, because in some ways, and it almost makes me think it's not even just, it is a test, but like you said, it's a lesson. Because it's the, I think it's an Italian proverb that says, when the gods want to punish us, they grant our wishes. It would seem very Trickster to sort of be like, oh, okay, you wish you had ultimate power. Let me give it to you and see actually just how terrible that would be. And I love that the way that they teach it is, and the way that he sort of finds the lesson is, by trying to help all of his shipmates. Because I've seen this in friends of mine, where, after college, a lot of us were not doing terribly well economically. And one friend went into the .com. I got out of college in 1999, the first .com boom. One friend of ours did incredibly well. And he was someone who was always sort of part of our friend group, but not necessarily like the closest with us. And started trying pretty hard to just use his money to buy closer friendship or not even to buy closer friendship, but to just, give us things that he thought we wanted all the time. And eventually a couple of our friends had to be like, you need to stop this a little bit because it's making us really uncomfortable. And some of this is stuff we want to figure out on ourselves. And so I love that that's how the lesson, that's how Will is taught that lesson, because it feels like there's so many ways that like Will could have used the power and become maybe kind of really corrupt or starting to be evil. But the fact is, his intentions never really change. He has the best of intentions. He wants to help everyone, but he gets so blinded by his power that he doesn't realize that he's actually doing a lot more harm.
Right. We're going to link to all these episodes down in the comments. But what Matthew's saying here is he uses his powers. He gathers the bridge crew together, and
oh yeah, thank you. Those haven't seen it recently.
He gathers the bridge crew together and is like, Wesley, the thing you want the most, here, you're 10 years older, you're an adult now. And Wesley ultimately is like, I don't want this, I want to earn it.
He winds up giving two beautiful women to Riker. But yeah, I'm trying to he offers to make Data human, and Data actually refuses. Or he actually even says before you say it says, I think you're going to offer to make me human. And I don't want that because I want the journey.
Unintentional Sanderson. Life before death, journey before destination.
Oh, yeah. I think he gives Geordi his eyes back.
He gives Geordi his eyes back. He gives, he makes Wesley 10 years older or something like that. He gives a Klingon woman to Worf. I think you hit everything.
Right. And
then everyone just rejects it. And then Riker's like, maybe I shouldn't be helping people.
Yeah. And I think that's sort of an interesting dual lesson there, because there's also a lesson for a lot of the crew members where, like I think Wes at first definitely, he's the one who at first loves the gift, but then only when he starts to think about it realizes there's a problem. And so I think there's also a nice kind of reminder there for not just for Riker, but for the crew of why, like the Sanderson reference, like you said, that the destination is more important. The journey is more important than the destination.
I just had a thought, and I'm going to follow it out here. I haven't thought it all the way through. We'll see what happens. You might have to cut this part.
Go for it.
So everyone tells Riker, no, I don't want this. I want to actually earn it. Is that a metaphor for the Q continuum? Because the Q continuum could just solve all the Enterprise's problems. But instead, they make the Enterprise work for it.
Interesting. Yeah, I could definitely see that. And I mean, I might even go a step further and say, is Q testing Riker and trying to get Riker to learn the thing that the Q already know? Or is the Q using Riker to figure out what they should do? Like it would be an interesting way to be like, we're kind of wondering what would happen if we just give humanity all the things that they want, that we have the power to give. Well, we certainly don't want to embarrass ourselves by doing something that actually is stupid. So let's put Riker in a position where he's going to do it and watch and maybe learn something from it. I think I'm now pretty deep into headcanon fan theory land.
Oh yeah.
But it's it's part of why I love the character of Q, honestly, is because he's written in such an open way. And it was funny actually watching these episodes. I was reminded until we get later into the show, the Q episodes, Q's maybe on screen for 15 to 20% of the episode. Like most of it is just him as a framing device at the start, the beginning, and in the middle a little bit. And I think part of why we can have so much fun with this is that Q is a great example of a character where they just create all of these threads for people to pull on, and they never really resolve any of them. Which sometimes is very frustrating to me as a fan, but somehow for Q it really works.
I agree. And for reference, Picard is only on screen for like 15 to 20% of an episode as well. So the episodes that Q's in being in 20% of the shots is huge.
Okay, that's a good thought. I haven't thought about that. Yeah, I guess because so much of the away missions Picard's never on.
And Picard's the main character. He's not the title character. Even in Star Trek Picard, he's only on screen for maybe 25% of the time. Yeah,
that's true. Yeah, I mean, they're an interesting mix of they're ensemble shows, but I feel like he's the primary protagonist, that, and especially that both the first and the last episodes of the whole show revolve around him particularly being tested is kind of a nice demonstration of that. But you're right, he's not on that often. Just kind of think that one of the things that I noticed with the Hyde and Q seems a lot crueler this time. That I'm trying to remember the details. I just wrote that as a note, but it feels like he's a lot more willing to let people suffer to prove his points than he was in the original. And again, I don't know if that's supposed to be his. I
mean, in the original, he freezes a guy, so.
Well, he freezes him, but it's pretty clear that person is not going to be permanently harmed. Whereas I think he, because doesn't there was so much that happened in that episode, but I remember like the scenes with Napoleonic combat. I think there's a couple times where he sort of says like, if someone dies, it's not a big deal. But that again, it might be his wordplay or things like that. Let's move on to I think another because we talked a lot about sort of the Q is the trial and Q is the all powerful being. And so let's shift to I think what are two of the most fascinating episodes, which is where we actually see Q not as the one who is all powerful and making humanity dance, but we're actually Q needs something from the humans. And I'm talking about two different characters here, because the two episodes I'm thinking about are Deja Q, where Q himself becomes human and has to live as a human because he's being punished. And then Death Witch, which is in Voyager, where a different member of the Q continuum, who was I think originally introduced to us in the subtitles also as Q, the subtitles list him as Q2, but eventually becomes Quinn, is the name he takes. and he actually wants to die and causes a whole question there. How do you think these different episodes differ in terms of what we're seeing about the Q when we shift from the Q making humanity dance to now the Q needing something from humanity?
Well, in the first one, Q actually does something to anger the continuum. And Matthew, you watched this episode as part of your study up for this episode. I did not. What actually does he do to get kicked out of the
interestingly
continuum?
enough, it's basically being too much of a trickster. And what they basically say is that you have been sowing far too much chaos around the galaxy. And it makes me wonder to some extent, especially now that you've given this Trickster God idea, is the Q continuum Trickster Gods, or is it that the particular aspect of the Q continuum that we know as Q, the John DeLory character, that he's kind of decided to go off on his own and to be this Trickster God, and that eventually the rest of the continuum got so sick of it that they were like, no, we're going to punish you for this.
So is the continuum more of the pantheon of gods, and Q would be the Loki?
Oh yeah, I like that a lot. I think that could definitely that could work for sure.
In the Voyager episode, we actually get to take a look inside the continuum. They take Janeway and Tuvok into the continuum.
Yep. And
it's basically just an Old West saloon. They're just hanging out. There's a pinball machine.
Mm-hmm.
And they're like, this is as complicated as we can make it so that you can still see it. But we're all just bored.
Yeah. No one talks to each other. And it's interesting because I think that episode especially gets into a lot of great questions about, immortality and ultimate power. Because the conceit of it is that part of why they're not speaking to each other is because there's nothing left to say. These same people, these same entities have all existed together for literally since the beginning of time. And now they're bored and now there's nothing to do. And what I think is interesting is that then you see between Q and Quinn, two very different reactions to how to do that. Q is, I'm bored, I have nothing to do, I want to, start. On the one hand, it's I want to start trying to maybe help some others or test some others. On the other hand, it's kind of like, spoiled rich boy thrill seeking. And on the other hand, you've got Quinn, who's just like, I'm done with all this. I hate immortality because there's nothing else to do in life. I would like to just die.
Yeah, I have one experience left, and it's to die.
Right.
Yeah. So Q1, John Delancey, is very much, I'm going to go out and explore the universe. And he gets punished by the continuum in that first episode. He gets kicked out of the continuum, actually, for being too much of an influence on the galaxy. Does that mean the continuum has their own version of the prime directive?
That's exactly what I thought as I was watching that episode, as I was wondering, is this a prime directive commentary? Which would make sense because it's in some levels. I mean, like I kind of wonder if you got a story about some of the much more primitive, but maybe like just barely spacefaring races that the Star Trek crew, comes into contact with, and would they see the Star Trek crew as kind of the equivalent of how we would see the Q?
They actually say that in that Voyager episode. Quinn and Janeway are talking. He's like, we're not all powerful. I think he's like, we're not omnipotent. Oh, it's Q and Tuvok. We're not omnipotent. You and your technology to any other primitive race would be just as superior to them as we are to you.
Yeah, that's a good point.
So it could very much be a prime directive thing.
Yeah.
The Federation has their prime directive so that they don't interfere with primitive cultures, and the Q could have their prime directive so they don't interfere with primitive cultures. And the Federation's a primitive culture to them.
Yeah. I think there's some possibility there, though. But I think an essential part of the prime directive is the idea of we are interested in going out and exploring. We are interested in helping these other races, but we have to have very specific rules of what we can or can't do. Whereas the Q, and again, maybe we're only seeing it from Quinn's perspective, but I think it is presented to us as though this is an accurate picture. It seems like they don't have any of that. What actually came to mind to me in terms of watching the Q Continuum as well as the character of our primary Q, have you seen the show Altered Carbon?
I have not.
Okay. I recently started doing a watch of it over on the Bingers Assemble podcast network, which, quick plug, we're doing an episode a day. You can go back and listen to some of the old episodes and or watch along with us. Great way to, if you're either a first-time fan of the show or love it, to hear some great discussion about the show and the ethical questions there. It's on the Bingers Assemble podcast, and I will have a link in the show notes. But one of the things that it gets into, forgive me, I'm about to give some actually, let me interrupt. Is it a show you're planning to watch at some point?
No. Well, probably, because
okay. Do you mind
sci-fi?
Do you mind if I give mild overall plot spoilers?
No, go for it.
Okay. So for anybody who doesn't want to be spoiled on Altered Carbon, probably skip ahead maybe 2 minutes or so. So one of the ideas of it is that because of technological advancement, people are able to separate the mind from the body. And so they can keep putting the mind into new bodies. And like in most cultures, the richer you are, the more technology you have. And so you have this group of the super rich who are now both basically immortal in many ways. They can be killed in very specific ways, but it's pretty easy to avoid them. And have lost most of their connection to the idea that other people don't have that. And so they're basically kind of like, they've lost the sense of the idea that their actions could have consequences. And they're also so bored that they start thrill-seeking, to greater and greater extremes because just they've done everything already. They're presented as pretty awful and depraved, and Q isn't shown as that. But I felt like that both shows are making the same point about what happens when you have incredible power without consequences, is that it becomes very easy to kind of let your moral, whatever your moral compass is, but to let that slip somewhat as you start thinking like, yeah, I'm going to be here forever. I'm bored. I don't know what to do. And I have all this power and I'm never going to feel the consequences. So why not?
So one thing that is not quite addressed in that Voyager episode about how bored these Q actually are, is that Q have the ability to travel through time.
Right.
So it's not necessarily that they have existed since the beginning of time, but that they have existed for all of time.
Right. Well, and that makes the point even more so then, because then it's not even like they have a chance to see the future and be surprised by anything. Yeah, so I think that makes that idea fall even more, that what we're seeing with the Q is a picture of just what can happen when that happens, and then seeing how John DeLory over these 7 seasons and over the many seasons of the many different shows keeps changing in his reactions towards humanity makes a lot of sense there.
So in the second episode that we were talking about in this group, we have Quinn, who is, I guess, from the past conversation you can gather, he's fed up with being a Q. He wants to die. Voyager accidentally pulls him out of his prison that he's been put in because he wants to commit suicide. Q are immortal. It's part of their identity as being Q, and if that were to change, it would cause a huge disruption in the continuum.
Right.
So the Q don't want to let him die. They would rather just lock him up and not let him die. So he accidentally gets pulled out of his cell by Voyager and tries to commit suicide, accidentally makes all the men disappear. Not important. Q1 shows up, the Q from TNG shows up and is like, "What did you do, Q?" Makes all the men show up again so that, half of the Voyager crew isn't just missing.
Mm-hmm.
And then Quinn actually requests asylum from Janeway And then there's this whole hearing about whether or not he deserves asylum. And that's the framing for the episode.
Right.
I forgot where I was going with that, but I'm sure it was important.
No. Well, I mean, I think I appreciate you doing that. But it brings up to me a number. It reminds me that I think that there's a number of different issues going on here because, I've said many times that what I love most about science fiction is when it presents us an ethical question in a world that is completely different and completely foreign to our own, but that also relates a lot to an ethical question that is very much in our world. And certainly when Voyager came out was right when, I think it was not long after Dr. Jack Kevorkian had been writing a lot about euthanasia, and certainly the topic of euthanasia was a very popular one, and one that was being debated highly. And it is framed in the Q and raised a lot of issues about the Q. But at the end of the day, this is also a euthanasia episode. And so I just loved that because it was such a great way of sort of modeling the, both the greater story about, incredible power that we might not relate to, but also a human story that's incredibly relatable.
Well, it sounds like Janeway has a good speech to end the hearing, and I wish I had the text of it so I could read it out for you. Maybe I'll find it and put it in the show notes.
I'll look for it while you talk.
But it's basically, I can't imagine, like, literally cannot fathom your reasons for wanting to commit suicide. And I can't condone suicide. But I know that you're not insane. I know that it's your life to live and not live as you choose. I think that was the gist of it. I hope you found it and can do it better justice.
I think you captured some great ideas, and I want to comment on it. But yeah, I'll go ahead and read it now because it's really good on this. Janeway, I've tried to find some way to reconcile all the conflicting emotions I felt during the hearing. My own aversion to suicide, my compassion for your situation. It hasn't been easy. I've tried to tell myself that this is not about suicide, but about granting asylum. Because in the key part is, I'm interrupting here, he's not asking for permission to commit suicide, he's asking for asylum, but if he's given asylum, he will be able to commit suicide. So that's the kind of difficult question there. So she says, it's not about suicide, but about granting asylum. That I'm not personally being asked to perform euthanasia. And as technically true as that may be, I cannot escape the moral implications of my choice. I also had to consider that a decision to grant asylum and the subsequent suicide of a Q might have a significant impact on the continuum. That such a decision could change the nature of an entire society, whether it be a favorable or unfavorable change, disturbs me greatly. But then there are the rights of the individual in this matter. I don't believe that you are mentally unbalanced, and I do believe that you are suffering intolerably. Under these conditions, I find it impossible to support immortality forced on an individual by the state. The unforeseen disruption that may occur in the continuum is not enough, in my opinion, to justify any additional suffering by this individual. So I hereby grant you asylum.
Yes.
It is a great speech.
It's top. Well, I guess there's a lot of great speeches in Star Trek, mostly from Picard.
Yeah.
but it's definitely my top something.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because what I like is that it frames the multiple ethical issues that are happening here. And it's, obviously this podcast is all about ethics, and one thing that I like to get into, and I'll say, by the way, that the TV show The Good Place did such a good job of demonstrating this, is that the problem with kind of like trolley problem kind of ethical approaches is you want to sort of say, let's just look at one ethical question in a vacuum, but you never can. Janeway is wrestling with 5 different things. And I really appreciate the kind of moral reasoning she goes through of saying, like, here's all the considerations, here's all the things, but at the end of the day, this is the core question, and the one that I think I have to base my decision on. And I love it because in the end, there's a lot this episode gets into about the ethics of the Q, for sure, and we'll go to that. But that one speech has nothing to do with the power of the Q. It's just about, what are the overall moral reasonings that she would use that then she has to say, if I would apply this to a human situation or a Vulcan situation, I have to apply it to the Q in the same way.
and it does end up disrupting the Q society, and there is a Q civil war, and they end up arming the Voyager with Q weapons, and
yeah,
it gets messy and complicated.
Yeah, but my memory though is that Janeway has, regrets about the implications of her decision, but she never thinks I don't think she ever says like I made the wrong decision. I think she's right about that. I think, as she said, like she didn't know the implications, and to some extent, even the fact that it becomes civil war is obviously horrible. But so much of what this was that there were huge problems in the Q continuum, and the Civil War is about people realizing that Quinn and John Delancey Q have some really important points, and that they're trying to shake things up, and that shakeup leads to a lot of problems.
Janeway's speech actually continues a little bit, and she says something along the lines of, I don't have the text in front of me, but she says something along the lines of, however, now that I have granted you asylum and you will be turned into a human, this is a new experience for you, one that you have not yet had, and I hope you take this opportunity to have that experience and be human.
Yeah.
Rather than committing suicide right away.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, which the character winds up listening to, but deciding to go ahead and not commit suicide. He
does commit suicide, and he does it with Hemlock, which is quite poetic.
Well, and in a beautiful turn, it's Hemlock provided by Q, who at the end says that that Quinn inspired him, and that I think that in some ways leads to because part of what he says is that he remembers, when he was the irrepressible Q before the continuum disciplined him. So knowing that and knowing the results that happened, do you think Janeway made the wrong decision?
In hindsight?
Yeah.
No, I don't think so.
How come?
I think that for several reasons. I think that Quinn did have the right to not be immortal.
Yeah.
Tolkien actually addresses this in the Silmarillion too. The god Iluvatar made humans and elves, and he made them different, and humans were mortal as a gift to humans. Mortality was actually a gift. No, it's a gift that they ended up trying to avoid at all costs.
Yeah.
but the ability to grow old and die was a gift from God to the man.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really interesting way of looking at it, especially because the flip side, a lot of the best vampire mythology, being the geek that I am of the 90s, for me, the main way I got this was the role-playing game Vampire the Masquerade, but certainly a lot of vampire novels and movies and the like also hold this idea. I think actually it's even part of the original Dracula by Bram Stoker, that the immortality that's given to vampires is a curse. It's kind of that flip side of like mortality is a gift, immortality is a curse, but it's for all these same reasons, that like living forever and seeing everyone else die and having no consequences, having no end to things is kind of horrible. I think I'm with you on Janeway, both because of Quinn, but also because like the Civil War, and I will say I have not seen those episodes in many years, so I may be misremembering. But if I remember, it leads to conflict, but to some extent that conflict is necessary, and that also tells us a lot about the Q collective. One thing I'm reminded of, or at least I think I didn't really put it into these words until what you said, but one of the things I think is most interesting in that that episode Death Wish is that the continuum is saying like we are very afraid of Quinn dying because we have no idea what it will do to the collective. And when Quinn pushes them on that somewhat, he kind of makes the point of, it's not that they know that this is going to be a bad thing, it's that they are so rigid and so locked in place because of all the things of immorality that they're utterly terrified of change and they're utterly terrified of the unknown. And I thought that was a really interesting thing of like, that the more you think you know, the more power and understanding you think you have, that the more that like, if there's only a little bit of uncertainty, that little bit of uncertainty would terrify you. I thought that was a really kind of insightful comment on something that relates a lot to our own world.
Well, and it's very much like our own experiences as people is the way things were is always better.
Yeah.
And if you've lived through all of time, the way things were is I lived through all of time.
Right. I've seen everything the way it's supposed to be. I know everything. And if you change something, now I have no idea what's going to happen. And that's really scary.
Yeah.
So there's been a great conversation. I'm sure there's a lot more we can go into. But I want to start moving towards wrapping up, which is, as listeners of the show know, means we're not wrapping up quite yet. But just kind of say like,
yeah, we got like another 2 hours. It's good.
No. What are kind of maybe is there any one or two more points that we didn't get to that you wanted to touch on?
No, I think I hit everything and threw my own headcanons at you, and
awesome.
I think I'm all good.
Cool. Well, thanks a lot, Steve. Really appreciate being on as a guest, especially with my regular co-host having stepped down, and at least a lot of us spending a lot more time inside. Both myself, I have a lot more time to record more episodes, but also you, the listeners, whether you are also social distancing and stuck at home, or whether you're doing one of those essential jobs that we're also thankful for, we want to get you guys a lot more comments, so get you folks a lot more content. So I'm trying to push these out a lot faster schedule, and Steve, really appreciate you stepping up and being a part of it. Not a problem. For folks who want to know more about you or your writings or stuff, are there places they can find you online?
Well, I will send you my Twitter profile. I haven't posted since like 2014 or so.
Well, people should at you with your their feelings about what you had to say today, and get you back on there.
Yeah, sure, at me, but not angrily.
Yeah. So, and of course, more than anything, I started this podcast because I love these conversations, and I love getting to talk to it with people like Steve and other guests. But to our fans, nothing makes me happier than when you all comment and give us feedback and give us thoughts. You can find us a number of ways. You can reach us on Twitter, on Facebook, or on Gmail, all at Superhero Ethics, and all those links will be in the show notes. And also, I am this podcast is part of a larger podcast network, the Stranded Panda podcast network, which basically, if you enjoy things like this, I think you'll love most of those podcasts. They're all about diving deep onto particular media content. As I mentioned on one of them, Bingers Assemble, which is all about kind of binge watching things. We're doing a deep dive on Altered Carbon. I also do a podcast on the Star Wars Universe podcast, the Star Wars Universe, and on the Orville Universe. Both of them are findable by those names and are in the show notes. And a particular note, two great friends of ours who are very prolific on the podcast network, Matt Carroll and Dave Robertson, they have a Star Trek Universe podcast specifically, which does great deep dives on Star Trek. They've done episodes on every episode of Picard, as well as a lot of things about older episodes and movies. And if you're a Star Trek fan, definitely recommend checking that out, as well as a lot of the other great content on there. So everyone, I hope you are having a good time listening to stuff. Please let us know what you think. Love to hear from you. Love to get your support on Patreon, or perhaps on just give us a 5-star review or any star review. Let us know what you think. Any way you want to support the show as we try to bring in more content is greatly appreciated. So thank you all. I hope you're staying safe. Wash your hands and have a great day.
Hello everyone, this is Jacob Milicic. I am here recording something special because Matthew wanted me to record something to tell all of you, Superhero Ethics listeners, what's going on with me and why I stepped away from the podcast. So I don't have a script to follow here, so hopefully I won't ramble on for too long, though as many of you who have been listening to the podcast for a while know, I do like to talk, so trying to keep this brief. What happened is that I got an invitation to join a project I had wanted to be part of for a while, and that project is called JudgeCast. So JudgeCast is a podcast for Magic the Gathering judges and people who are engaged in Magic the Gathering, where they talk about things that are relevant to being a tournament official for the game of Magic the Gathering, where it be talking about stuff about different rules, changes to how we handle different situations in competitive tournaments, how we run tournaments, uh, how we deal with what we like to call the soft skills, which are really just interaction with other people and best ways to handle that. It's a very valuable tool for people who are engaged in Magic the Gathering judging, and something that I've always wanted was the ability to have some of my ideas about where we can improve, um, and also some of the, you know, I I hesitate to use the word agenda, but I have things that I would like to see put out into our culture more, and so being part of that podcast allows me to really try to be I don't want to say heroic because that sounds dramatic, but it's part of that whole being super idea where I want to put myself into a position where I can reach out and have some of my ideas reach other people that I might not have been able to reach and affect how they think about approaching uh, the situations they get into in more positive ways. So, especially now during this time where we are dealing with uh, it's a very unique situation in our world. It's very difficult to stay connected and to feel like we are staying connected. And a project like JudgeCast, what it does is it lets all of those people who, magic judges have really formed this community with each other. A lot of them see each other multiple weekends in a month, um, every month, and so this sort of forced isolation that many of us are now a part of, it can be very difficult to feel still connected to that community and to keep that going long term. And so that's another thing that now more than ever it is valuable for things like podcasts in general, but that one in specific, to be to be around, to be recorded, to be available to people, to help with that feeling of connectedness, to help get that across. And so I needed to wait, make sure that it was still going to go forward, make sure that I was going to be taken on. There wasn't any snags, and the first episode with me announced as official is now up, where we talk about our culture around making mistakes and how we deal with it and repercussions therein. I think it's a fascinating discussion. So, if you're a Magic Judge, if you're part of the Magic the Gathering card game community, I encourage you to reach out and listen to JudgeCast if you enjoy hearing my thoughts. I'm very much the same person. Um, Possibly I go a little even more off the rails there, since the subject matter is not always as heady as on superhero ethics, but we have fun, and I think there's a lot of value to be provided there. And the reason why I needed to stop doing superhero ethics is my free time, that is to say, the time that I can devote to projects such as this, has a functional limit that I need to keep on it in order to make sure that I pay attention to other things that are important in my life. And if I do not honor that, I will absolutely sign up for literally everything. And I've done this before. I have this habit where I'm excited about something, I enjoy doing something, and so I throw myself into it. And I do that for multiple things, and they build up and it builds up and it builds up, and then suddenly I don't have time to devote to the people who are close to me because I'm spending all of my time doing these other things, maintaining these other plates that I'm spinning. And I've been in the situation a couple of times, and each time I've had to cut things off, sort of cold turkey, go, no, shut everything down. And I sort of realized at one point that if I could manage how much time I was devoting to those kinds of things, and put a number on it, say, okay, only this much, only only that long, and if I could do that and hold myself to it, that I can still engage in those ways with the things that I want to, things that I'm invested in, but I do have to have that limit, or the kind of person that I am, I just keep piling things on my plate until it's no longer manageable or tenable. So I proactively manage ahead of time, and that's why me saying, well, I'm going to take on another approximately 2 hour in total every other week recording gig means that something that took up exactly that same slot has to go, and that is unfortunately for people who appreciated hearing me every week, every other week on superhero ethics. That's superhero ethics. Uh, Matthew and I are still in talks about doing a couple of things down the road with me on as a returning guest, and certainly should it come to pass that I no longer wish to be on Judge Cast, or Judge Cast no longer wishes me to be on, um, at that point, that time would be freed up again, and it is a possibility. I don't want to promise anything, but it's a possibility that in that future I would come back as a regular host to Superhero Ethics. But right now, I just don't know. So that's where I'm at. That's the update, and I hope all of you are keeping safe, keeping healthy, doing what you can during this time to stay connected. I'd encourage everybody actually to engage in the methods that we have available to us in this interconnected era to help stay engaged with people. Something I've personally been struggling with throughout this is, I don't have the kind of face-to-face connections that I used to, and I'm a very extroverted person. I like to be very social, and so this whole thing surrounding COVID-19 and the world response to it has been incredibly stifling for me. So it's been very difficult for me to really appreciate uh, the this situation and really find out how I can manage myself, how I can make myself still stay positive throughout this period of isolation. Thankfully, I am married and I do have somebody that I can interact with, so I at least have one person daily that I get to interact with. But I miss my friends. I miss the people that I get to see got to see, I guess I should say, on a regular basis, and the activities that we had. Um, it's even to the point where I'm missing some of my coworkers more than I normally would, just because again they're human beings that I was used to having face-to-face interactions with. And one of the things that I've discovered that works really well is, scheduling times for get-togethers like you would do normally, social get-togethers, but doing it online, making sure you can hear people at a minimum, and through, whether it be Discord, Skype, Google Hangouts, anything like that, Zoom meetings, anything like that, can help you stay connected, help you feel that you're staying connected. And then video, if you can, helps a lot because we as human beings respond to faces uh, differently than we respond to just staring at a blank screen. Um, so anyway, I think I have possibly met expectations for how long I have talked. Sorry if this is a bit quiet. My wife is actually so Larissa is her name. Larissa is currently taking a remote belly dance class. She's got weekly dance classes she's been a part of, and her studio has started doing these remote sessions during this time. So, kind of thing I'm talking about. Anything you can do to try to stay connected to help manage yourself and manage your needs, your social needs as a human being, A plus. So, I have my gain down as a consequence of that, so that hopefully very little to none of that actually comes through and the audio remains mostly clean. Uh, that's it. I hope you all are doing well in this time, and hopefully you'll hear from me again not too long from now.